Well, good afternoon if you are in New York or Boston, and good evening if you are in Berlin or Vienna, and good overnight if you are somewhere east of Vienna. I'm Fred Plotkin. This is Fred Plotkin on Fridays, and very specifically, it is the 5th of March of 2021. I give the date for a reason. My guest is my longtime friend and colleague, Anthony Rudel. From this point forward, I'm going to call him Tony. And if the name Rudel rings a bell, it's because he is the son of Julius Rudel, the maestro and impresario, who was born on March 6, 1921 in Vienna. And therefore, tomorrow is the 100th anniversary of his birth. And we're going to talk about Tony first for a while, and then we're going to talk about Julius Rudel. And I know you have many, many memories of him, and I have a few. And so, Tony Rudel, welcome, and thank you for joining Fred Plotkin on Fridays.
Well, it's great to be with you, Fred, although I feel distanced. You and I have spent many more hours standing next to each other in an opera house than we are right now. But it's great to be with you. And I know that your father shared the birthday with my father, although 2 years younger.
Yes, my father, a trombonist, was born March 6, 1923 in New York City.
Right. So it is wonderful to be with you today and to mark the anniversary tomorrow, which is kind of weird to think that my father came into the world a century ago. And but I guess we'll have some time to talk about what he did for the world. And
I think we have some time.
Yeah, so we'll have some
Tony,
fun
let's
with
start
that.
with you. I know you.
Oh God.
Many people who join me on the show, apparently, if they're New Yorkers, seem to have all grown up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. What is it about the Upper West Side and music from your point of view?
I don't know, but I realized not long ago I was talking to somebody about where my father lived for the last 40 years of his life, and it was at 101 Central Park West, which is on 70th Street. And if you just walked 4 blocks, you could encounter in the 1980s Julius Rudel, Leonard Bernstein, and James Levine living within a 5-block area of each other. When I was growing
Anton
up,
Coppola being another one.
Right, and Anton Coppola was on Central Park West, I think, in 67th, if I'm not mistaken. I actually
and if we're getting technical, also Madonna, but that's a
yeah. I went to school with Anton Coppola's son. He was in my class at Collegiate, which is one of those small world things. But the Upper West Side was just vibrantly artsy, I guess. We had before I went to Collegiate, when I was a little kid, I went to the École Française, where, full disclosure, my first violin teacher was Yo-Yo Ma's father. And that was, I was supposed to be talented at age 5 or whatever it was, but I clearly missed the musical gene somehow. But, I went to school with people from the Upper West Side, like Shira Stern and all the Stern kids who lived there. And, Beverly Sills lived on the Upper West Side. And
she lived on 81st Street. Yeah.
81st Street. I guess part of it was that Lincoln Center was on the West Side, but that was later. That was in the 60s. So I don't know, but it was fun because you could bump into all these people. I mean, Itzhak Perlman lived on 70th Street for a while.
And Emanuel Axe lived on West End at, I believe, 79th. But I have a few theories about this. One was, there's a building on 73rd and Broadway called the Ansonia. And the Ansonia is a much older building. It's one of these grand old palaces in a way that has very thick walls. And therefore, it attracted music teachers, opera singers, instrumentalists, and so on, many of whom lived there because the walls were so thick that they could practice all day and night and not disturb their neighbors. So it became a refuge for musicians. And at one point in the 1920s, the great baseball player Babe Ruth and Enrico Caruso both lived at the Ansonia. So I think part of the reason for the West Side being so musically intense was that it was, the Ansonia was the magnet. And then 72nd Street, right as World War II was beginning and all through the war and after the war, was a magnet for Viennese refugees. And they brought their musical culture with them. And therefore, and they brought bakeries, frankly, and
Lots of
cafes.
bakeries, right?
And that was a very important area. And then people like Bela Bartok came and lived in the neighborhood. He died in the neighborhood. There was no Lincoln Center, just so people know. The Lincoln Center came in the 1960s. But further down was Carnegie Hall on 57th Street. And Carnegie Hall in the past had studios in the building where artists, musicians, Marlon Brando, for example, lived in Carnegie Hall in a studio apartment. And it was a cultural center beyond being a magnificent concert hall. And diagonally from there, and I'm suddenly forgetting the name, but is a beautiful old apartment house with thick walls as well. And I know you know it. Leonard Bernstein lived there. His teacher and later his assistant, Helen Coates, lived there. Gary Graffman, the pianist, who will join me on April 2nd, lives there. Nice. And so that building, like the Ansonia, but on a smaller version, attracted all of these figures. So, and then on 59th Street on Central Park South, there were buildings where many, many opera singers lived. Franco Corelli lived on 57th Street. And then finally, there used to be a wonderful hotel called the Mayflower on 61st Street. And the Mayflower is where many foreign opera singers and instrumentalists would stay, because it was right between Lincoln Center and Carnegie Hall. And the Mayflower had a very particular distinction. It allowed animals of all types and of all types. So that more eccentric people who had a cheetah or a chimpanzee or whatever could live with their animals in the Mayflower. Montserrat Caballé used to stay at the Mayflower when she came to New York. I had an aunt who had many marriages, and between marriages, she resided at the Mayflower and loved the animals. And this is a very old New York thing you wouldn't see now. She had a leopard coat and a leopard hat, which my mother found abhorrent because my mother is very pro animal rights, as I am. But my aunt had a real leopard coat and hat. And one time she stepped into the lobby and a man, and this is no joke, was out walking his lion in the lobby. And the lion came over and nosed around the leopard of my aunt and approved and then went on his way. But it was a particular neighborhood. It still is, but now it's become a little more generic and a little more blended. But it was an intense artistic community. It had many cinemas. It had 11 cinemas in about 2.5 miles.
Right. Well, you mentioned the Ansonia, which was very much a European style apartment hotel. And I think that attracted artists too. But there's another logistical reason when you think about it. The old Met was technically on the west side. It was much easier to get to the Met from, say, Columbus Circle or the Mayflower than it is from the east side, where you had to come across and then go down. So I think geography and location has a lot to do with it. And I think that a community starts to build out of that, as you pointed out. But it was fun growing up in that neighborhood.
We did. And I mention that because people often ask me, and I'm sure you, how come we have so much background in music and the arts? I went to New York City public schools. I was not a rich kid at all. But it was very possible at that time to be completely immersed in the arts and have them accessible. And it's what makes me a New Yorker more than anything else, because I have certainly my European side and I work in Europe and live in Europe a lot. But the most New York part of me is that formation for culture that is part of the birthright of a New Yorker.
Well, and let's be totally transparent in that I was born in 1957, which was the year my father became general director of the New York City Opera. So once I was old enough to go to the Opera House, there were days, I remember days when I was in first or second grade where the Opera House would become my babysitter, in a sense. I would go and watch a rehearsal, or even in second grade, and this was the beginning and end of my theater career, when my father produced the world premiere. Now I'm not going to remember the name of the opera, but give me a second. Yes, Lee Hoybe's Natalia Petrovna, which is based on the Turgenev novel, A Day in the Country. Bill Ball was directing, wonderful stage director. And one night I was in bed asleep, and Bill and my father came into my room and said, "Could we borrow you for a second?" And I said, "Sure." Why? I was 7 years old. And they said, "Come into the living room. We want to see something." And they had me act out a scene, half asleep. And Bill looked at my father and said, "He'd be perfect." And I was cast as Kolya. Now, the good thing about Kolya is I didn't have to say or sing a note, because I can't sing. But I was on almost in every scene. And so I would go from school to the opera house for staging rehearsals. And, you know, that's not the youth that most people get. So it was a very unique immersion.
But it is in a way an Upper West Side youth, because so many people who worked in the arts in one form or another had children. And I love that you use a word that I use, and I've never heard anyone else use it. You said the New York City Opera was your babysitter. The New York Philharmonic was my babysitter. And people know me for opera, but I actually began learning symphonic music well before I learned operatic music. And that's because my mother worked at Lincoln Center, and there was no such thing as daycare at the time. And we children were deposited with the guards at what was then called Philharmonic Hall. And Leonard Bernstein said, "Why are these children outside?" The guard thought that he was angry. And he said, "No, bring them inside, bring them into the auditorium." And so I was part of the focus group that Bernstein had as he developed his young people's concerts. So
right.
It's, you and I, frankly, are not the exceptions. There are many, many people of our generation who were taken into these theaters so that they were not forbidding. They were not mystical to us. They were home. And they were my churches in a way, and my synagogues, more than houses of worship.
Yeah. I mean, I can think back to, and I mentioned this to you when we spoke earlier, that I can remember performances of Don Giovanni where my father would put a stool in the pit next to the podium. And especially at the old city center on 55th Street. And I would sit on that stool for the entire production, for the entire performance, while he conducted from the harpsichord. And I remember just realizing that I had the most unique seat in the house, that no one else, except for my father who was conducting, had the visual perspective that I had. And I remember once, I couldn't have been more than 6 years old. I was sitting there, and the second act was about to begin, and I went in and took my seat, and the woman in the front row leaned over and goes, "How do you get that seat?" And, you just kind of go, you have to know somebody.
I was born to it.
I was born to it. So, but yeah, I appreciate this, your use of it. The house, and one of the things I've spent a lot of my career trying to do, and I think my father tried to do it, but he was as a musician, and you certainly have spent a good part of your career doing it, is trying to show people that coming into this house, our church, our place of worship, is not daunting. That
it's
if
welcoming.
You're not trained in it, it's still wonderful. And that's a very hard thing to do. Very hard thing to do.
Tony, what I'd like to do is go through a brief timeline of your dad's work, because then we can expand on it. And I'll do it, but I want you to jump in if I've left anything else important.
Sure.
He was born in Vienna, March 6, 1921. And his father was a lawyer, I believe. Is that correct?
He worked for the Phoenix Life Insurance Company.
Life insurance.
Right, which my father always referred to his father, who died very young. He died when my father was 16. He referred to his father often as a mid-level executive.
Yes.
Which to my father probably meant absolutely nothing.
I mean, I do know your grandfather died of pancreatic cancer, and suddenly your grandmother and her two sons, Julius and Ludwig, were in Vienna 1937, and very soon thereafter came the Anschluss, in which Germany occupied Austria, and they got out. They were able to get out and come to New York. They had family in the Bronx, I believe, and your father delivered things, and he worked the way a lot of New York boys work, doing whatever jobs they can get. And he went to the Mannes College of Music.
Right.
I do know, because he told me, I had the good fortune to know him a bit, that he loved music in Vienna, that he went to the Vienna State Opera, that music, as in many households, was present. I find it fascinating the degree to which Vienna and New York are so similar in so many ways. The sense of humor is very similar. The passion for music is similar. People may not know that the Vienna Philharmonic is younger than the New York Philharmonic by a few months. They were founded in 1842. So they're both very old institutions. We have shared many musicians, Mahler coming here, Bernstein going there, many musicians such as your father being born there, coming here, having to come here, then some of them going back. And so the exchange is huge. Vienna and New York, along with Buenos Aires, are the three cities in the world with the highest percentage of people who go to psychiatrists. So there's
that explains that right there.
That explains everything about Vienna, New York, also Buenos Aires in a way.
Yeah.
And so while at Mannes, he graduated, I believe, in 43, 42, 43.
42.
Okay.
Graduate, yeah, it's 42 seems to be the official date. But let me just jump back and fill in a couple of small blanks for you, if I could. So the first opera he saw was Carmen in 1924 with Maria Jeritza.
Wow.
And he wrote in his memoir about how he never forgot that experience. Of course, later in his career, he met Jeritza and they became very good friends. So it sort of brought it full circle. But Carmen was the first opera he saw and the last complete opera he conducted. So there's a certain beautiful symmetry to that.
Did he ever tell you if it was in German or French?
You know, he never mentioned it to me. I don't know the answer to that, but he was struck by this opera and became, a music fanatic. And I'm not going to bore you with all the details. You mentioned also, though, a thing about him, all the jobs he had. And there was one night in my childhood that I'll never forget. We were walking home from the State Theater. It was one of those, late February. The City Opera had probably opened the third week of February. It was late February and it was blowing snow and, that Upper West Side wind coming down Broadway. That so we were walking up Broadway and we got to where Zabar's was because we lived on 82nd Street.
Zabar's being a shrine of food, a place to buy food.
A shrine of food, exactly. But next to Zabar's was a drugstore that was known as the Beck's Drugstore. It was an old-fashioned apothecary. And my father turned to me, and there's an irony in this, in that I was a teenager and we had a charge account at that store. So if I needed something, I would go in and say, bill it to my parents, very gallantly. And as we were walking by it, he said, it was nights like this that I hated working here. And I said, what do you mean you hated working here? Turned out that he had been a night delivery boy for the Beck drugstore. And there was this certain strange feeling that, he was now an internationally recognized conductor and he'd been their delivery boy. That's one of those stories. But the other one that I only found out a few months before he died, he always talked about having to work in a button factory when he got here to make money. And all my childhood, I heard about, he did this to make money because he needed to pay bills, but he wanted to study, but he never gave up music, which is great narrative. And so about 6 months before he died, I'm sitting with him in his living room. And I said, Dad, let me ask you a question. You always talk about that button factory and how it damaged your hands and how awful it was. How long did you work there? And he looked at me and said, I only worked there for 2 days. But in my childhood, he'd worked there for 50 years, So he did have all these odd jobs. He graduated from Mannes. David Mannes gave him
actually, no, I'm going to interject a couple of things.
Go ahead,
in New York
please.
City, the old Met was on between 38th and 39th Street on 7th Avenue. And 38th, well, that was the fashion district and the garment district, we called it. And 38th Street very specifically were two things. They were milliners, in other words, hat makers, and they were shops that were called notions, and I never knew what a notion is. And my uncle had from Budapest had one of these shops, and I
Huh.
said to him, Uncle Lou, because they were milliners and notions, I said, what is a notion? He said, you know a notion when you see it.
Yeah.
But they made buttons. They had thousands and thousands and thousands of buttons.
Buttons.
And this was on 38th Street. And my uncle, poor at the beginning of his arrival here, would walk from his shop. He would close it and walk to the Metropolitan Opera House and pay a few shekels, as he said, and stand all the way at the top of the opera house. And he heard Caruso and Yeritza and all of these people in standing room. And I mention this, Tony, because it is an example of how art of all types was available to everyone here. Everyone.
Oh, going back to Vienna, before the Anschluss, my father was part of a claque, and he, in fact, was in the same claque run by the very famous, I'm sure you knew him and worked with him probably, Marcel Pravi.
Of course. Talk about who Marcel Pravi was.
Marcel Pravi, I only met him in my adolescence, but he and my father were dear, dear friends. He was a producer, an intendant, and it was Pravi who in 1956 convinced my father to come back to Vienna to work at the Volksoper and to do Kiss Me Kate, which was the first time an American musical had been done in Vienna. So that's 56. But I also, going through some boxes of my father's stuff, I found some programs from the Volksoper while he was there. And he never mentioned to me that he also did Carmen and Don Giovanni while he was at the Volksoper, rehearsing for Kiss Me Kate. And I'm looking at the cast for the Carmen, and the Escamillo was Eberhard Wechter.
Wow.
So it's like, wow, he never mentioned that. He only talked about the Kiss Me Kate. But Marcel was also at the Staatsoper, and was just an amazingly creative opera person, if you will. But he was in the claque. Now, my father had a rule. He would take the ticket to be in the claque, and he would take the fee.
Claque being people who were paid to applaud one person and boo another person.
But my father refused to be on the booing side. He would never boo an artist. He would only accept the fee to applaud. But by doing that, he was able to go to the Staatsoper on a very regular basis in the 1930s.
Yep.
And, he would stand up in the top ring. And in fact, when the whole family went back to Vienna on his, in 2003, we all traveled back there. He walked with all his grandchildren up to the spot where he stood as a teenager. And you think about the conductors that he saw. I mean, Strauss, Toscanini, Furtwängler, Knappertsbusch. So, his musical chops were formed there in Vienna, but he came here, and David Manis, he auditioned. Manis gave him a complete scholarship.
So now I'm going to interrupt again on a couple of things. Tony, our conversation will be like this, pal. I want to go back to the topic of Carmen for a particular reason. That is important. Carmen, as we know, premiered in Paris at the Opera Comique, not at the Paris Opera, in 1875. And it had a great deal of dialogue, a lot of dialogue. And Bizet died, and therefore he couldn't correct it in any way. And the next company to present it was in Vienna, the Vienna State Opera. And they didn't want all that French dialogue. So they had someone compose based on Bizet's notes and sketches, sung through music for most of the dialogue. And so the version that we mostly hear today is the Vienna version, not the Paris version.
I didn't know that.
And in addition to that, because it was idiomatic, it was often sung in German in German-speaking countries. And my first Carmen was in German. It was Christa Ludwig. And she was a terrific Carmen. And only a few years later did I see it with Grace Bunbury in French. And I thought, well, there's something wrong with this because Carmen is auf Deutsch. And I didn't realized, and I met Grace Bumbry and I said, how come you sang it in French? She said, why shouldn't I? I said, well, because it's in German. No, it's not. This is where I learned about this. But the point again is the fact that an 11-year-old could have access to Grace Bumbry to talk to her about the opera. And I'm not special. This was kind of typical. So there's that. And the other thing is Marcel Prowy, who is a marvelous man. He was. And he once said, and I'm quoting him, but then I'm completely disagreeing with him, that he saw me as the American version of him. And that's a huge compliment. And I don't see that, but he's a wonderful role model. And
he was the most amazing guy. The last time we saw him was on that trip in 2003. He had just turned 90. And my father and my kids and my wife and I went out we were in Salzburg, and we went to the place, the retirement community he was living in, and we visited with him. And they started out in German and speaking, the two of them. And I finally said, listen, I can't keep up. Could you switch to English? And of course, they instantly switched to English. But listening to them talk about opera, it was as if it was the greatest crash course in music from 1930 to 2000 you could ever have. And I had it was a year after I'd published the novel that I wrote called Imagining Don Giovanni, and I brought a copy of it for Marcel because my father said, we have to bring Marcel two things: York peppermint patties and your book. And so we did. We actually traveled to Europe with 2 large bags of York peppermint patties because that was his favorite candy. So we sat with him and I gave him the book, and he looked at me and said, you know the problem with Don Giovanni? I said, what? He said, it was written before Fidelio. And I said, why is that a problem, Marcel? He says, because dramatic opera begins with Fidelio. Everything before that's very nice, but dramatic opera. And he and I got into a disagreement over this. And my father finally leaned over to me and whispered, don't argue with him, you can't win.
Can I introduce another name into this discussion? George Jelinek.
Oh.
George Jelinek, for listeners, was Hungarian. He was part of the same generation of men and women who came out of Europe and came to New York, and in some cases Los Angeles, and enriched our cities with their erudition. And you and I have both worked at radio station WQXR here in New York. And Jelinek he was known as Jelly, had a program that was so wonderful. He never lost his thick accent, and he was so erudite, but so genteel, but not in a phony way. Yeah. We at the time on WQXR had 2 stations. We had the FM, which was music, and the AM, which was talk about music. And all the great artists coming to New York would come to speak to Robert Sherman, George Jelinek, and other people. And we had that channel was musical education for the masses. Yeah. And I'm getting to that because when we talk about New York City Opera, I want to reflect back to this concept of music available to everyone. Talk about George Jelinek.
Well, so I lucked into my radio career as a junior in college in 1977. Walter Nyman, who was then the president of WQXR, put me on the air, and I learned my way and fell in love with radio as a medium. George Jelinek was the music director at that time, and I learned tremendously from him. And the thing you didn't mention in that wonderful recap of George is he hosted a show called The Vocal Scene.
Yeah.
And The Vocal Scene was just the most wonderful deep dive into opera. And he did it in the most natural way. George had written a fabulous biography of Callas, as I recall. And so when I got there, of course, I was the kid. I was by far younger than anyone on the air, and it was wonderfully exciting for me. And George, obviously, and I became friends, and it was hard for him not to ask, so what's the New York City Opera going to do next year? And so we talked about that often. George was a wonderful man. He had you used the word warm, and that's exactly right. There was a natural warmth to him. we worked together. In 1983, I became vice president of programming. So I took over all the programming and the sound of the station. So it was a little weird because all of a sudden George was working for me. But then he retired because he'd had some heart issues, but he stayed on the air, and he had a wonderful way about him on the air. Despite the accent you mentioned, he brought you into the world of opera as few people could do. And he was a fabulous interviewer because he was truly curious, but he was most curious when talking to singers or conductors, opera conductors. But a wonderful guy, and also trained in the European tradition. So we had a lot of, I loved George. It was great to work with George.
And therefore, again, this exchange, I'm going to call it Austria-Hungary for the moment, to embrace that whole world, George
Right.
Schulte, all these people who were from the Hungarian side of the Pannonian Plain, as opposed to the Viennese side. But so back to your father, to Julius Rudel, there was a new company that miraculously was founded during the Second World War. And when I think about it now, the fact that a company called the New York City Opera was created during a war when resources were depleted by our then mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia, who was also had a program on radio station WNYC, which is now the parent of WQXR, WNYC being the city station. And he would talk to the public that way. And he was very opinionated about music. And he formed the taste of a lot of people because he was very pro Puccini and very anti-Richard Strauss. So for quite a while, New Yorkers had a big diet of Puccini and not much Richard Strauss. But the New York City Opera was founded as the People's Opera. And it was created in a building that we call City Center. Now, in preparation for this, I read up a bit about the history of that building. It was a Shriners temple, and I never really knew what the Shriners were, so I went to their website. And apparently they were influenced by the Masons, who were in their way influenced by ancient Egyptian customs and traditions and rites. And when we see the magic flute, the Zauberflöte, we are seeing an enactment of that on the stage. But the way the Shriners defined themselves were influenced by the Masons, but with fewer rites and more fun. And and they were founded in New York in the 1870s as a fun-loving group of men who liked to do benevolent things for other people. And they were lawyers and doctors and all the trades and so forth. And they wore sort of strange turban-like, not turban, but fez-like Egyptian hats. And they were depicted as slightly silly, giddy people. But they built this magnificent building completely in fake Egyptian design on West 55th Street near Carnegie Hall. And it was there that Fiorello LaGuardia had the building converted from the Shriners Mecca Temple, they called it, into the city center for the people of the city of New York. And the names of the companies that lived there had city in it: New York City Opera, New York City Ballet, founded with George Balanchine at that time. And it's remarkable that two of the great institutions were founded during World War II by the mayor of New York City for the people of New York City. And now I'm going to hand to you, your father was not the founder, Leopold Hallasch, but very soon thereafter, your father came in weeks after the founding. And what happened?
Yeah, so the story goes that he saw the ad, which from what I've seen was about this big, in the New York Times, saying the new opera company is looking for people to audition. And so he saw that and he went, with his new resume from the Mannes College of Music. By the way, at Mannes, one of the great ironies is he studied conducting with Carl Bamberger, but he studied competitions with George Szell. And he did compose, but I mean, he never wanted his music to, he became a conductor. So he went to Hallasch and he said, I'm trained and I'd like to work here on the music staff. before the Anschluss, his greatest dream in life was to become a rehearsal pianist at the Staatsoper. So he goes to Hollis, and Hollis says, well, let's see what you can do. And Hollis makes him play 6 weeks of auditions as his audition.
Mm.
So he just sat at the piano, and every singer would come in and say, I'm going to do Che gelida manina, and he'd play it on the piano or whatever the aria was. And he was an incredible sight reader. I mean, he could take, he and Astera, who wrote operas for him, would hand him these scores of, this big, and he'd sit down and synthesize it in his mind. But okay, so go back to City Opera, 1942. He plays all these editions. At the end of it, Hollis says, well, we'll make you a repetiteur, which is a glorified, as he said, glorified jack of all trades. And this first season was 1 week of opera beginning in February of 43. And on the 70th anniversary of that, which was February of 2000, no, it was February of 44, excuse me. So in the 70th anniversary of that would have been February of 2014. The musicians of the City Opera did a pension fund concert to mark the date with some wonderful singers. And he wanted to go. And he was not well, and he was in a wheelchair at that point, but we brought him. And what was amazing is we were backstage, and I realized that 70 years had passed since that opening night. And we were standing exactly where he'd stood as that 22-year-old kid.
Mm. I just want to specify one thing. I was at that concert that it was held at City Center. Right. New York City Opera eventually left City Center, as we will discuss, but they came full circle by coming back to where the company was born.
So we were backstage, and he looked at, and actually Placido Domingo was there, and they were talking. They'd been friends for 50 years at that point. We went over to sort of 2 rows back in the wings, and my father said, this is where I stood and gave the wrong cue on opening night, because he couldn't see the conductor because there was no television hookups in those days. But yeah, so the City Opera began then, and he was a rehearsal pianist, but they saw the talent, and he made his conducting debut in one of the Lehar works. So I just can't remember which one right now. It may have been Merry Widow. And I guess his talent started to show, and he got engagements elsewhere. And as City Opera grew, he took on more and more responsibilities, conducted more and more. So Hallas started it. He left. Joseph Rosenstock took over and gave my father a few conducting assignments, usually 3rd or 4th performance of something, occasionally, a revival of a production, but he wasn't becoming a superstar conductor, but he was conducting elsewhere. He was starting to get engagements. And then when Rosenstock left, Erich Leinsdorf came in.
And I'm going to stop you there because I want to add something for audience.
Please.
We make certain assumptions now that we could not make about the past. Even now, Black people are not always given all the welcome in opera that they should be, and we're trying to improve that, but we have a way to go. But at that time, City Opera integrated its chorus. It had Black soloists well before Marian Anderson got to the Met in 1955, and well before Black artists had leading roles such as Leontine Price, Martina Arroyo, and Grace Bumbry in the early 60s. And men later, unfortunately. But City Opera was completely in the vanguard about that. And City Opera, I think we always have to acknowledge, let's call it the social political elements of what that company meant. That any person, immigrants, because New York had and has large immigrant communities, could pay very little money. That was the other difference. The Met was a lot cheaper than now, but it was still an outlay for people. City Opera was completely accessible financially for the button workers and the pharmacist delivery boys and everyone. If they wanted to see an opera or a ballet at the New York City Ballet, they could at City Center. Yeah. And therefore, my elementary school teachers went to City Opera. They couldn't afford the Met. And it played such a vital role. And it was often referred to mistakenly, I believe, as New York's second opera company, and I used to call it the other opera company. Not just because of the financial issues, but because City Opera, and this, then I'm going to hand to you, from the very beginning, did such a huge and adventurous range of repertory that the Met didn't do.
Yeah.
The Met did do premieres, but not many. But City Opera kept presenting new operas, and I know you're in your dad's era in charge, 35 new world premiere operas, which is remarkable.
Yeah. No, you put your finger on it, that it was more adventurous. There was rough years in 54, 55, 56, and then the company was about to go under. And a group of singers went to the board and said, give us one more chance. And they said, well, why do you want another chance? Because we know who should run it. And the singers went to the board and said, let Julius Rudel run it. And so in June of 19, or earlier than that, I guess, in February of 1957, they announced that Julius Rudel would be the new general director. And he opened his first season with Turandot. But then the real adventure began the next year with doing all-American seasons, which was funded in part by the Ford Foundation. You mentioned Black artists, and it's still a long way to go, but somebody collected for us a fabulous list of Black singers who began their careers under the Julius Rudel era, during the Julius Rudel era at New York City Opera. And it's an amazing list, including Shirley Verrett. You forget that she started at City Opera. And there was George Shirley, a wonderful tenor, Faye Robinson, Veronica Tyler. I mean, the list is just marvelous of great singers. And somebody asked me about it, and the truth is, to my father, it didn't matter what the color of the skin was. If it was a great artist, he wanted them on the stage because it was all about creating great art. And I think as somebody whose religion was persecuted, he was much more open-minded. And
did he ever speak to you about prejudice in the arts, whether it was racial or religious or gender or any of those things?
We didn't discuss it. I found among his papers, and there are boxes and boxes of his papers that I still haven't gone through, but a thing, and I wish I had it in front of me and I don't, but it was about how it was all about equality. And it was something he'd read somewhere. And it was about how laws are there to protect people, but morality is really what brings people up. And I think of all the people I've known in my life, he is one of the more ethical and moral human beings I have ever encountered. But when it came to the arts, it made no difference who you slept with, what your leaning was, what your religion was, what the color of your skin was. If you could sing Don Ottavio, you were going to be in Don Giovanni. It made no difference to him. And that's the beauty of art, I suppose, is you can just let the art shine through, which is what he believed in.
But it is unfortunate that there are, especially now with the rise of stage directors in opera who don't come from the opera world, but come from the theater world, they look at the physical aspect of a singer and say, she's too old to be Mimi, or he's too Black to be this, which is unfortunate, but it happens. Or that one feels too gay. Any number of things that they won't verbalize,
right?
But it's subtle prejudice. It's unspoken prejudice.
But let me give you a perfect example. You mentioned earlier Montserrat Caballé, one of the most glorious voices of the 20th century, ever. Well, the ones we know anyway. And she and my father had a wonderful working collaboration. They recorded Mephistopheles together. She plays a Margarita. They did a series of Ballo and Mascaras in Hamburg that would blow your mind how great she was. But the thing, in 1977 in Spain, her home country, she decided to do Salome. Now, if you're thinking what you're just talking about, the physical nature, there is this thing called the Dance of the Seven Veils. And Montserrat Caballé was not exactly the most agile person. Not only were they producing it for the theater, it was for television. And I've watched it recently. And I will tell you, my father's Salome is pretty damn good.
Yes.
But that voice, you don't care what she looks like because the performance is so transcendent that Strauss's music sounds in a way you probably never imagined it. And I said to him once, we were talking about that production, and he said, it made no difference what she looked like because you'd fall in love with that creature, that beautiful creature singing at you. And it's, if you get a chance to see that, it's available. It's pretty
Well,
cool.
she said to me, I had the great honor and pleasure of working with her a lot, and she had a terrific sense of humor apart from anything else, that her best opera recording was Salome.
I believe that.
She said, that's me at my best. And it was interesting because you wouldn't immediately associate that, but nonetheless, and it's a phenomenal performance, you're right. But again, it's this egalitarianism that was a product of New York at that time. And I should point out to people who don't know, Mayor LaGuardia was a Republican. And
isn't that funny?
he was Italian and Jewish, and was attuned to the fact that Italians had faced prejudice for many years, and even in the 1940s in New York, because Mussolini was siding with Hitler, Italians were not always treated kindly in New York City, even though that had nothing to do with Mussolini, and often fled Italy to get away from that. Toscanini fled Italy to get away from the fascists. And certainly the Jews, even though we didn't know everything going on in the Holocaust, we knew the Jews had been horribly treated. And LaGuardia, being an Italian Jew who loved opera, and was a Republican back when Republicans were different from now, it's a phenomenal achievement. And he insisted that it be for everyone, the people's opera, which sounds practically communist now, but in Vienna, they have what's called the Volksopera, which is the people's opera, where your father conducted. And again, it's a similar concept, but the big difference being that New York City Opera was so forward-thinking. And I'm going to hand back to you in a moment, but I just want to say that the Ford Foundation, there was a man named Mac Lowy, Lowey.
Lowry,
I'm sorry.
Lowry.
And he was so forward-thinking that Julius Rudel could come to him and he would provide money for all American opera seasons to foster new art in the United States in the late 1950s. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I mean, you think of some of the works that still stand out. I mean, one that is still a favorite of mine, and was, I know, a favorite of his, of my father's, and in fact, his youngest granddaughter is named for the opera, Carlisle Floyd's Susanna, which he would conduct anywhere, anytime, because he just loved it so much. But you have others that came out of that period, you know, the Menotti works, the Consul, that come from that same group, and the commissioning of operas, which, you know, he was able to do as head of City Opera. But one of the things that strikes me, Fred, and I don't know if you've ever thought about it, is that when the City Opera was told they would have to move to Lincoln Center, to the State Theater, which, by the way, was a theater designed for Balanchine, for ballet, not for opera. So my father had to do some acoustical changes to make it, you know, he was very worried about the increase in costs and the increase in scope that this would mean. And, you know, he was a natural administrator. I mean, one of the things he did, and I'm actually very proud that I inherited the gene, he used to keep the whole budget in his head. He could tell you to the dime what a production cost. And that's a skill that is fun to have, and he used it to his advantage. But when they moved the company, when you think about it, okay, the gamble is you're moving this company that has just gotten 9 years later back on its feet and is doing wonderful stuff. I mean, you know, they did the American premiere of Fiery Angel of Prokofiev. They did Katerina Ishmailova, or Lady Macbeth of Mitensk, as it's now known, long before anyone else even knew the opera existed. And So now he's going to move the company to this new thing called Lincoln Center. And what does he decide to do for the first season? I've got an idea. Let's do all 20th century opera. Which, when you think about it, is a ridiculous gamble. But he did it. And he opened the house in February 22nd, 1966, with Ginaster as Don Rodrigo, starring a 25-year-old Placido Domingo. And it brought the place down. And that began, I think, if you had to pick a decade from 66 to 76 or 77, that was the most incredible 11 years of opera in New York.
So what I'm going to do for background, because not everyone listening is from New York City. In fact, many people are from all over the world.
All over the world.
You've heard of Lincoln Center. In New York City, we have various squares that are named for presidents. Washington Square Park in Greenwich Village and Jefferson Square. Madison Square on 23rd Street gave the name to Madison Square Garden. And Lincoln Square is an area around 66th Street, 65th Street, where Broadway and Columbus Avenue intersect. And it was the Upper West Side, as we discussed before, but that very specific area was not like the Upper West Side above 72nd Street. It was very poor and impoverished. In fact, that's where I grew up. And there were tenements and slums. And if you've seen the film West Side Story, many of the scenes were filmed on the street where I lived. And then once the film was made, they announced that Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts was going to be built there. President Eisenhower in the late 1950s, I know the date, May 14th, 1959, came to New York with Leontine Price. They both had helmets on to do the first dig of the first bit of soil to build this supermarket of culture, as people started to criticize it for being. And how would this happen? They would destroy Carnegie Hall on 57th Street and turn it into a parking garage, and the New York Philharmonic would move to Philharmonic Hall. They would destroy the old Metropolitan Opera House and have the Met move to a new company at Lincoln Center. They would not necessarily destroy the city center, but have the two resident companies move to Lincoln Center. They would take the collection from the New York Public Library of Performing Arts, in other words, the Performing Arts collection from the New York Public Library, and move it to Lincoln Center. The Juilliard School, which was all the way uptown, would get a new building at Lincoln Center so that the students could directly interact with all the performers. That was a wonderful development. A cinema was created, the Chamber Music Society, later jazz at Lincoln Center. I think the positives far outweigh the negatives, but there were some definite negatives. Thankfully, and this is a long story made very short, Isaac Stern led a campaign to save Carnegie Hall, and thank God, because it's a jewel and we love Carnegie Hall. And Clive Gillinson, who runs it, is a very enlightened arts administrator. So we're blessed to still have Carnegie Hall. The Metropolitan Opera House was destroyed, the old Met, which to me is a tragedy. I always thought the City Opera might work there, but it nonetheless was torn down because the Metropolitan Opera Association, in its founding, was actually a real estate company. And the land on which the Met stood was more valuable than the building itself. And there was no landmarking at the time to preserve great buildings and temples of art and history. So the Met was destroyed, and they built the new Metropolitan Opera House in the middle of Lincoln Center. I worked at the Met for many years. I loved the new Met. I wouldn't ever regret they're building the new one, but I'm sorry that the old one was destroyed. Now, they also built Philharmonic Hall, which opened in 1962, which was devastated by bad acoustics. Leonard Bernstein, the conductor of the New York Philharmonic, criticized it. It's had its own very long trajectory. It's a building I happen to love. Even though it's the first building, it's the most modern looking and most forward looking of the buildings. Now, the New York State Theater, Tony, I don't know the degree that you know the history of the building, but in 1964, we had the World's Fair in New York City.
Right.
And this was built by New York State. And there's something on the first tier up called the Grand Promenade that has enormous sculptures by Ellie Nadelman, and there are gold ceilings, and there were, at the time, curtains made of 8 million little tiny beads. And it was said that each bead represented one citizen of New York City. And this Grand Promenade was intended to be the official receiving room for the people of the city of New York. So if a dignitary came, the mayor would go to the Grand Promenade, and those receptions would be held there. Ultimately, everyone except me and maybe you forgot that, and people no longer use it for that, and they built kiosks and boutiques, and it's just not what it was. But that building was given to New York City for $1, and making it officially the home of the City Ballet and the City Opera. Now,
Right.
I'm going to have a guest in April, Marin Alsop, the great conductor. Her parents were in the orchestra. Her father, I believe, was concertmaster of the New York City Ballet. So I want to talk to her about growing up with the New York City Ballet. But yes, the acoustics, Mr. Balanchine flattened the acoustics so that you would not hear the footfalls of his dancers when they danced on the stage. And that was not congenial to have live sound for opera singers. And
No.
from the very beginning, the uncomfortable relationship of having both City Opera and City Ballet as resident in that building. And I remember being in the hallways, and you'd see dancers walk by and opera singers walk by, and they would sort of look the other way. They're just, unfortunately, they never merged very well. Tony, what can you tell us about that era and the relationship in the building of the New York City, of the New York State Theater, and the two companies that were in it?
Well, part of that relationship, the nexus of that relationship was the board chairman of the city center, whose name was Morton Baum. And Morton Baum was wonderful to George Balanchine, and he was wonderful to my father. And he made sure that Balanchine and my father got along, and they did. They were both tremendous creative people. Balanchine was fine with my father's acoustic changes to the hall because it was simply, I mean, there were some simple things. Like, if you recall, in the back of the orchestra, there was a viewing room that Balanchine had built in so that he could go in, or his staff could go in and watch a performance from dead center in the back behind a glass wall so they could talk and not disturb the audience. Well, my father's in there for his first rehearsal, and he's hearing an echo, and he can't figure out where it's coming from. He turns around and he realizes the glass windows in the back of the hall are just shooting the sound back at him. So they went to the, okay, we'll take the windows out when the City Opera is performing, and we'll put them in when the ballet is here. So that was an easy thing. He then had panels installed along the sides, if you recall. They were like scalloped panels, which didn't affect the footfalls of the singers because that didn't project that way. But it helped the singers, and it helped the connection between voice and pit, stage and pit. One of the things there are two things my father always wished he could have had fixed before it happened. One was to increase the size of the pit. So when he did Don Rodrigo, he couldn't fit the whole orchestra in the pit. So he, being a man of the theater, put the horn, there were 12 French horns in Don Rodrigo. He put 6 of them up in the hall, which created a wonderful antiphonal effect. But he would have rather had them in front of him so you could actually see them. The other thing he did, he always said he wanted to do, was dig an aisle down the middle. He wanted to get out of that pit and have an aisle down the middle. But of course, from a ballet perspective, having that wonderful uninterrupted curve was great to see the stage. But he'd be rehearsing and he'd want to go back and listen to the acoustic or to the balance, and he'd have to get out and walk all the way around, and it would take too long. So, but look, it was a big move from the city center to there. And, he told me many times he was afraid of it because and now, of course, the Met is no longer 15 blocks away, but next door. And there's a great story that, so City Opera moved in on February 22nd, 1966 was the opening. They did their, what was called the winter-spring season, February, March, April. And then they went away, summertime. And of course, that September of 66, the Met opened on a Monday night in September with Barber's Antony and Cleopatra. The night before, New York City Opera did Handel's Julius Caesar. And my father didn't, he always said he didn't do it intentionally, but I wonder sometimes, because all the international press was in New York to see the opening of the Met. And of course, what happened is they all went Sunday night to see what the City Opera was doing. And the City Opera was doing a Handel opera, which no one did in 1966. Mm-hmm. And it was a production starring Beverly Sills, Norman Treigle, Beverly Wolfe, Maureen Forrester. And it was, as history has shown us, a huge hit and actually opened up the whole Baroque opera revival. So the next morning, there was a Lincoln Center council meeting, and my father, as head of the City Opera, was on the Lincoln Center council, but he couldn't make it to the meeting, but he did send them a note in which he said he wanted to congratulate Lincoln Center on finally getting a second opera company.
And they're both, I never thought about this. I know the dates because I have this thing for dates. That was September 15th, 1966 for Julius Caesar, and September 16th for Antony and Cleopatra. I never thought about it. They were both Egyptian themed, and Cleopatra knew both guys.
That's right. That's right. But it was, and you think about it, couldn't be more different in terms of style and the musicality, but that Caesar became, I think, that was the beginning of the greatest era of productions.
So let's introduce a name right now because we were going to anyway. You just did Beverly Sills. When people talk about the history of the New York City Opera, they mention two names above all, Julius Rudel and Beverly Sills, both of whom were key musical figures and then key administrative figures. And I want to direct everyone to get your father's memoir that he published not soon before he died, called First and Lasting Impressions, published by the University of Rochester Press. And Tony, you know my feeling about that book, that it's very much in his voice. I felt he was talking to me. I don't think that he did the punctuation and the copy editing, and that needed work. And I also felt, and I think you've confirmed for me, that there was a lot more material that didn't get in the book. So that I hope that when you go through his papers, and I imagine you are going to plan where to house his papers eventually, that there's another bigger book in this based on what he did. And I'm wondering, Tony, did he do oral history or is it all written?
There is an oral history that he gave to Columbia University, which is in their archives, and I've read it, and it's impressive. You know, Brett, I'll tell you something funny about my father. First of all, he was a horrible paper keeper. I mean, terrible. He after he died, and I started going through folders, the temptation just to take big plastic bags and throw everything out was tremendous because it was such a mess. There was one folder I found that I'll never forget, about this thick, just crammed with paper, and on the front of it was written HM. So I'm thinking, what the hell could HM be? Handel's Messiah? I mean, you know, I doubt he'd have this much paper about Handel's Messiah. So I start going through it, and it's page after page of schedules and rehearsal schedules, but it's making no sense because nothing's in sequence. It's just crammed in here. And I came this close to saying, hell with this, and throwing it into the recycling bin. And then I came across a piece of paper that was folded like origami and shoved in. And I pull out the piece of paper, and it's a letter. And I will paraphrase a letter. It was typed, "Dear Maestro." Maestro was crossed out and handwritten in was Julius. I just want you to know what an honor and privilege it's been to work with you on this project. It has meant so much to me personally, and to know that you and I share having escaped that tragedy, blah, blah, blah. In fondness, Elie Wiesel.
Uh-huh.
and it was HM Holocaust Museum.
Yes.
My father did the benefit concert to raise money to build the Holocaust Museum. So I couldn't throw things away, but he was a terrible paper keeper and terrible file keeper. About
so let me
6
just
months,
briefly,
actually,
parenthetically, Tony, because you and I are, this is like tennis. Your father, simultaneously with being the head of the City Opera, was the first music director of the Kennedy Center in Washington, where they built the Holocaust Museum. Okay, back to you.
he was actually, there's a great story about that he went to lunch with Arthur Schlesinger at the not the University Club, but at the Century Club, and the table was set for 3 people, and the third person was Jacqueline Kennedy, who showed up and told him about the plans for this, and she said, "So, I'd like you to be the first artistic director." My father, said some things to her about, well, it's hard for me. I've got the opera company and I'm conducting a lot in Europe. And she said, that wasn't the question, Maestro.
But actually,
So
you didn't do her voice. That wasn't
I did not do her voice.
That wasn't a question, Maestro.
Right.
She was I knew her as much as anyone could know her. I knew her and got to work with her a lot. And one of the most magnificent people I've ever known. And she had that voice where she could, she was like New York's queen, but she didn't run the joint, but if something had to happen, she would make it happen.
Oh, and she made it happen. So he took the position at Kennedy Center, but took no salary because that's how he wanted to repay the country that saved him. So yes, there was actually a point in the 70s when he was general director of the City Opera, artistic director of the Kennedy Center, music advisor to Wolf Trap, music director of the Cincinnati May Festival, and music director of Caramore simultaneously, which is insane. But so how did I get off on that tangent?
Well, I was talking about his memoir.
Oh, this is the memoir.
That I want everyone to read it because I read it. I was very moved by it when I read it years ago.
So 7 years ago tomorrow, I was with him on his 93rd birthday, which would be his last birthday. And we were sitting in his library and he looked at me and he said, the advantage of longevity is you get a chance to look back and think about what you've done. And I said, this is the first time in your life you've looked back on what you've done? He said, in truth, pretty much. When he wrote the memoir, it was sort of the beginning of that process. He always was looking for the next thing and never looked back. And so there's very little in terms of pure documentation of what, the missing pieces, if you will. He kept so much of it in his head, like he would keep scores in his head. Look, the relationship, how his years at City Opera ended is public knowledge. He had said he would resign in 1975, but didn't.
I'm going to get there in a moment. We're not quite there because we want to cover the golden age, but something you just said actually begs a question. And if you don't want to answer, you don't have to, but it did come up in my mind. If he had all of those responsibilities in Washington, New York, and all those companies and so on, and just running one opera company is more than full-time. What was it like being children and for your mother in that time when he was so much away and so much in demand and conducting and rehearsing and administering because he was a maestro and an impresario as kids and as young adults?
Well, it's not there are many answers to that question, and there are many parts to the answers to that question. I am the youngest of 3. By the time we get to 1970, which is when I turned 13, both of my sisters were out of the house and married. So it was really my mother, my father, and me living on West End Avenue. My mother, I don't know if you ever got to meet her. She was Rita. She was at her funeral in 1984. My wife, who I'd only known for 3 years at that point, we've been married for 1 year, less than a year, turned to me at the end of the eulogy for my mother and said, I had no idea she'd accomplished all that, because her career as a neuropsychologist, a leading neuropsychologist in the world, was so overshadowed by what he'd done and was doing. How she did it all, I don't know, Fred. I mean, she would go to work, come home, cook dinner, change into evening clothes, and go watch him conduct, and then come home and start again the next day. Our childhood, I think my sisters and I all have different views of our growing up, because I was born when he became head of City Opera, but by the time I was 6 years old, I'd been to Europe 3 times. It was pretty special. I don't think as a child or as an adolescent you realize how special that is. But as an adult, I look back on it and I realize how incredibly special it is. And now the full disclosure part, where all the amateur psychiatrists can spend time on this. And by the way, there's a great line that a very, very dear friend of ours, who was a brilliant psychiatrist, said to me once. He said, Tony, I counsel male patients, never to compete with the memory and ghosts of their fathers. And in your case, I particularly think it's a bad idea. So I caveat this answer with that story. But it from the time I was 14 until I was 17, my father and I did not have a good relationship. We talked very little. I was more interested in baseball than I was in opera.
That makes sense to me, though.
I was a pretty good baseball player.
Yeah.
And, someone once said to me, "Did your dad come watch you pitch?" And I started laughing. I pitched for 4 years in high school, and my parents couldn't tell you that I pitched. But I think you or I anyway cut him a great deal of slack because I was resentful during those years. I mean, he was as superstar-ish as you could get. I mean, and I would love to have those 3 or 4 years back, but you can't, as you and I talked about long at the beginning of this, you can't go back and relitigate that time. I will tell you what turned my head and what changed my life. There was a Saturday, my senior year of high school, so it was in April of 1975, and I was at our apartment, and there was a broadcast of the Met, and it wasn't very good, and I turned it off because it didn't appeal to me. But I knew that my father was conducting down at the State Theater, so I went up to Broadway, got on the 104 bus, which means something to you, but probably not to most of our listeners. And I went down to Lincoln Center, and I just walked into the State Theater because I could. And it was Ballo in Maschera. And I'd never heard Ballo in Maschera. And it was second act. And I stood in the back of the first ring, off the Grand Promenade that you talked about. And all of a sudden, the grandeur and the beauty and the passion hit me. And I suddenly reconnected with his world in a much more meaningful way. And then I went to college in New York, so I was at Columbia. And my love for opera was really rekindled at that moment. And so I was able to go to many of the performances. I remember Raimi doing Mephistopheles in the late 70s was a pretty good thing. Or the Figaro with Catherine Malfitano and Sam Raimi. And there were some pretty wonderful performances at City Opera in the late 70s. And I fell in love with the world of opera. And he started teaching me about running an opera house. And I joke sometimes, all my friends' fathers taught them how to throw a baseball. My mother taught me how to throw a baseball. My father taught me how to run an opera company. And I've never forgotten the lessons he taught me in those years. So that is sort of a much more open explanation of our relationship. I will tell you one of the best moments for me in terms of my relationship with him, and I mean, there were thousands of great moments, but this one in particular, I'll never forget. I went on the air at QXR on October 15th, 1977. On his birthday in 1978, so March of 78, I'd been on the air roughly 6 months. and I came down from Columbia to take him out to lunch. So I met him at the State Theater. You remember there was a deli called Orloff's?
Of
I
course.
took him
Sure.
to Orloff's for lunch. And as we were walking back to the State Theater, so I could get on the subway and go back to a class, we bumped into Julius Baker, the flutist from the New York Philharmonic, who I'm sure you knew. And the two of them see each other, and he conducted the Philharmonic, so they were friendly. And Julius, good to see you. Hug, hug, hug. And Julie Baker says to him, you know, Julius, I've been dying to ask you a question. There's this guy on QXR whose name is Tony Rudel. Are you any relation to him? And he looked at me and he said, my son. And it was like, wow. So there's your one moment, there's your one glimmer of my outshining him just for a moment. But he was an amazing guy. But
also you make it a point there that one of the great wonders of Lincoln Center, and as I said, I'm very pro Lincoln Center, is that it's an artistic community.
Yeah.
Not just the Upper West Side where we meet each other in dry cleaners and delis, but it's an actual place where artists and audiences, but especially artists sort of in the underground passages of Lincoln Center where we'd run into one another. We knew each other in our different buildings. There was not apartheid among all the buildings. And
no.
It really was and is, but especially at that time when it was new and people had to work together, a complete art. And yes, Mr. Bing, Rudolph Bing, who was then head of the Met until 1972, and Vini's Jewish origin himself, had his issues with people who he just didn't like. He was sort of, I was very fond of him, but he was very austere and not exactly a mensch. He didn't show that side of himself if it was there. But I'm not knocking Mr. Bing because he was very special. But he tried to make the Met grander and different and special. And remember, I worked at the Met. I never worked at City Opera. But that said, we at the Met were aware of City Opera and the great things going on there. And so many people who sang at the Met first sang at City Opera: Beverly Sills, Phyllis Curtin, Samuel Ramey, Placido Domingo, Jose Carreras, Frederica Brunstata, Catherine Malfitano, Cheryl Mills, Shirley Verrett, many. And it was a breeding ground for great artists who then would get their great acclaim and then move to the Met. I want to go back to something about the State Theater, especially as regards Beverly Sills. She once told me that, well, I asked her, I said, why are the productions at City Opera that have a soprano staged in such a way that there's sometimes awkward stagings? And she said, honey, that's called the sweet spot. And I said, what do you mean? She said, it's the place on the stage where I sound good. And so that when she would do a production and then say Carol Vaness or Ashley Putnam would then do it in later years, the director would have the director's book and stage it in the sweet spot way so that, you know, I remember Carol Vaness once said to me, I like to move around. And they said, no, you stand there because you're going to sound better right there. So don't move. And Sills often sang from one particular spot, downstage, little stage left. And the productions were built around her.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, but you know, she was Sills was a phenomenal singing actress. I mean, she could pull off anything. When that Manon production premiered in '68, it was a Fragonard painting come to life, and it was spectacular. Look, those years, 66 to call it 76, 77, and then things got a little rocky. But my father's head was gone from the City Opera by then. And the thing that people forget, he made his Met debut.
We're going to get to it, but I want to focus on those City Opera years. Then because that's where I met him and came to know him and work with him, was at the Met, but he was not at the Met yet. I was an audience member, frankly, and I admired him, but I didn't know him in any single way. We never encountered each other. I may have met you before I met him. Now that I think about it,
that's very possible.
And but Sills told me a story that I'm certain you know, and I will start it and you can grab it if you want. That when they were doing this production of Manon, two stories from that. One was she liked to say that she developed her character from the young innocent girl to the toast of Paris to then being toasted in Amiens and having a bad end. Um, that she picked different shoes for every scene, and that her shoes conditioned her walk, her approach to the role. It was I've written about Beverly Sills' shoes in that opera because she gave me a long interview on that once. And the degree to which she said, my feet were always planted on the stage, no matter where I sang and what I did. And because she was saying, a tall, larger, older woman playing a 16-year-old girl, she said, I had to feel the ground differently as a peasant girl than later when I got to Paris and had fancy heels. So that's story number one. Story number two was that they had live poultry, fowl, chickens on the stage. And there was one time that a chicken took flight and went off the stage and into the orchestra pit, and your father was conducting and grabbed it and held the hen in his left arm while conducting with the right. Tell me I'm sure he told
you. No, you got it exactly right. It actually ran around the orchestra pit for a while, and finally it got close enough to the podium that he could grab it, and he held it. Fortunately, it was near the end of the act, but he was able to look. He could do miraculous things in the pit. There was a performance of Rosenkavalier at City Opera where there was a terrible traffic jam or traffic accident on the George Washington Bridge, and the second flute didn't show up, and they had nobody to play the second flute part. At the beginning of Rosenkavalier, there's a lot of second flute. My father whistled the part while he conducted. That's a trick. To think about the musical talent to do that. Now that's a trick. But yeah, the Manon, Sills was a great Manon, and that is, you talk about, somebody asked me, what is my favorite recording of his? I don't have one, but that is certainly high on the list. That Manon with Guetta and Baquier is pretty special.
And Nikolai Guetta, yeah. Well,
Guetta.
On that recording, and in much that Sills did, you could hear the acting in recordings.
Yes.
She didn't have her studio performances and her stage performances. She brought the stage into the studio, and it was there completely. I suppose my favorite, Julius Rudel, there are two, and you gave both of those, in fact, on your list of recordings on Adagio that there are many that he conducted. Obviously would be the Boito Mephistopheles, because I love that opera, and it's Norman Tregel, Domingo, and Caballé, as you said. But Erich Korngold's Die Tote Stadt. And part of that is I'd never heard it before. And the production at City Opera, and it was Frank, and I'm forgetting his last name. He died a couple of years. Frank Corsaro. Was so innovative. It was beautiful staging, but it was also the first time I saw an opera production that introduced film. Right. Now we would call it video, but then it was film.
Right. Then it was film.
As a remarkably effective way of evoking Bruges, where the opera is set, as Die Tote Stadt, the Dead City. And Bruges is a very beautiful city, but the way it was filmed and shown in this opera production was extraordinary. And City Opera didn't always have a lot of money, but their productions, for the most part, were very effective and innovative. There are exceptions, of course, but for the most part, they were quite something theatrically. And I think that was a lot of what made the company a draw, was theatrically. Yes, the Bohemes and the Carmens were very traditional. I should say that, by the way, in the mix with all this unusual repertory, there was a steady diet of Bohème, Carmen, Cavaliere Rusticana, Pagliacci, and Traviata in Tosca to bring in those working audiences who maybe were not ready for Tote Stadt, but it remained the people's opera through that era.
Well, so I'm going to refresh your memory. He actually never conducted all of Die Tote Stadt. The production at City Opera, he didn't conduct. It was Gabor Edfish who he brought in to conduct. And the recording, I think, is Leinsdorf with Neblet,
Could it
if
be?
I'm not
Okay.
mistaken. However, and this is what's fascinating, the great aria, the soprano aria that is the
Marietta's lead. Yeah.
Marietta's lead, he recorded twice. First with Sills in the 60s or early 70s on the album Welcome to Vienna. And it is spectacular, but the tempo is so slow as to make it a totally different sounding thing, because she could float that stuff like no one else could. And in fact, Marietta's lead in Sills and Rudel's hands there is very French. Well, then later in his career, probably 30 years later, he made an album with one of his absolute favorite friends, whose birthday is also tomorrow, by the way, Kiri Takano.
Kiri Takano in 1944.
Right. She was born, and they shared the birthday. And, he conducted her very first Fior di Legge at the Paris Opera. So they were dear, dear friends. And so she recorded an album of German opera arias. And Marietta's lead is on that. And I think it's 1:45 shorter than the Sills recording with my father, and it still works. Mm-hmm. But that was one of his great gifts as a musician, was knowing what to do with a singer. There are a lot of great conductors who have no idea how to work with a singer. He had that musicality to make a singer shine in a work. And so and I listened to both of those recordings, and I think they're both available on the Adagio. You should listen to them. They're so different and yet both so appropriate and so right. So, but he never did the whole opera, and I think he regretted that. But one of the things about his years at City Opera is he didn't take all the new productions himself. He believed in bringing in conductors and sharing. And I actually went back and looked at the list of conductors who worked under him. It was Thomas Shippers, Stokowski. It's quite a list of impressive conductors who came in. So so the Todestadt is a gorgeous thing.
So I do want to go back to the 1950s briefly. There's a question I meant to ask you. On your list of recordings that you gave, 2 of them are by Kurt Weill. Yeah. And did your father know Kurt Weill and Lotte Lenya? They were refugees in New York at the same time?
Yeah. He did not know Weill, but he met Lenya. So in 1958, he produced Lost in the Stars at the City Opera as part of that first All-American season. And he fell in love with the work. And then a few years later, he did the Drei Groschen. And
Threepenny Opera.
The Threepenny Opera. And he did it at City Opera. And he just loved Weill's music. And I think because of that, Lenya put him on the board of the Weill Foundation. And he was a lifelong member. And in fact, they're doing a beautiful tribute to him on their website tomorrow. Mm-hmm. But he fell in love with Weill's music. And in his career, he did 3 different productions of Lost in the Stars. He recorded it. He did a Threepenny Opera, not only at City Opera, but then on Broadway with Sting, which was a lot of fun for him. It was a different approach. He did the world premiere recording of Die Burgschaft, one of his Berlin works. He also did Street Scene, which he adored. He recorded
I love
Silver
that too.
Lake.
I saw that.
Yeah. He loved Street Scene. He did Silver Lake with Hal Prince at City Opera.
Saw that too.
With Joel Gray, and they became great friends because of that. So there was something about Weill's music that just spoke to him. And then one of his most unusual recordings, he recorded the Second Symphony of Weill. And that's available. And he also recorded the Threepenny Music Suite for winds, which is wonderful, and the Violin Concerto, which is a very unusual piece. So there was something about Weill's music that just spoke to him. And so Lotte Lenya, he met Lenya. Lenya insisted he be on the board. And that was a connection that meant a great deal to him throughout his life.
Now let's go toward the late 70s and changes at City Opera. Before we get to what he did after that, because that's where I come in and we'll talk about that. And that's when I met you and so forth, 40 plus years ago.
Yeah, please.
We were babies. And what happened at City Opera in the late 70s?
So there are all kinds of versions of this story, and the one that is the fact is the one he wrote about, and that is what happened. His career in Europe in the early 70s, he was in Stuttgart, Hamburg, Vienna, was really starting to take off. By 1973, he was a regular. Lieberman had gone to Paris and basically brought him from Hamburg to Paris. And
Ralph Lieberman.
Ralph Lieberman, great
Not
impresario.
Goddard. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, not Goddard. Although he probably knew Goddard Lieberson too, now that I think about it. But, so he was conducting the Paris premiere of Forza del Destino, and he was a regular in Paris. And the demands of City Opera were just becoming too great on a man who just wanted to conduct. So he began to think about resigning in 75. And probably had in mind leaving by 77, which would have been 20 years, and that would have been a very nice, and then go conduct. Because also he'd made his Staatsoper debut in 76, doing Fledermaus on New Year's Eve, which was a big deal for him. I mean, talk about
returning to Vienna. Yeah.
Returning to Vienna in that house where he'd been in the claque as a teenager. This was a big moment. So his career was really taking off, and City Opera was weighing on him. And I can tell you that at one of those performances of Mephistopheles in the late 70s, so 76, 77, Ralph Lieberman was there to see it. And I was in my father's office because he never used the dressing room. He always used his office. And Lieberman came in and closed the door. My mother was sitting on the couch. And Lieberman looked at him and said, "Why do you need this?" And I said, "What do you mean? This is my company." He says, "Why do you need this? You need all this work? You're a great opera conductor. Give it up." And my father had thought about giving it up in 76, but there was an orchestra strike. And he didn't want to leave the company in a bad way. So he agreed to stay on. But then he worked out with Beverly Sills that he would step down. She would become general director. He would stay on as principal conductor for a couple of seasons as a transition, and it was all agreed. Don Samuels was the new board chair who was trying to make a name for himself. And it was all very hush-hush. My father had made his Met debut in October. You probably know the date. I think it's October 8th.
October 7th, 1978, Werther with Domingo and Elena Obraztsova.
Correct. And I think he felt pretty good about his decision to leave, and they were going to announce it in December. And then on the morning of the announcement, we woke up to the New York Times front page headline, "Julius Rudel ousted by City Opera Board." And somebody had leaked the story, trying to get credit for him being fired. And his press person, who will remain nameless, came over that morning, and my mother looked at my father, and I was standing in our foyer because it was a press conference at noon. And he laughed and he said, "They can't fire me. The board in 1968 gave me a lifetime contract." And my mother looked at him and said, "Do you want to stay?" And he said, "No, I want to conduct." And she said, "Then go and resign and tell the story of what they just did to you and walk out and leave them hanging." He was too much of a gentleman to do that. He wouldn't do that. So the press conference occurred, and I was sitting at the press conference because I was a QXR in those days. I was sitting next to Spate Jenkins. And Spate,
who was a journalist who later became the head of the Seattle Opera.
Seattle Opera, correct. Wonderful guy, good friend.
Yes.
Spate stood up and asked Mr. Samuels, "Did you fire Julius Rudel?" And, he gave some fuzzy answer. "Well, not really, but, we have differences of opinion," whatever he said. And I looked at Spate and said, "Ask the question again." And Spate said, "I can't." And so then this whole brouhaha started. I don't know who did it. The best thing was my father was out. He'd had enough. He stayed another season, but he hated it. He had an obligation to conduct some things, which he did. And he couldn't wait to be done with it. And he didn't return to the State Theater for 25 years.
Yep.
after that.
Così fan tutte, correct?
Right,
Which
correct.
was
He went back.
wonderful, wonderful. I think Giuliana Di Giacomo, then a very young artist,
Correct.
sang Fiordiligi, and she was great.
Correct. She was filling in, and she was the cover. And my father said, "Well, I think it was supposed to be Karen Armstrong got sick."
Mhm.
And my father said, "Well, let's use somebody new." And
Yeah.
he taught it to her, and she was wonderful. But yeah, for 25 years. So that was the end of the City Opera thing. But he also was music director of the Buffalo Philharmonic at that point.
Yeah.
Which was 6 years. And my mother got sick in there, and she passed away in 84. And if you really look at the trajectory of his career, if you look at from about 82 on, it just, that's one great thing after another. I mean, he did, as you know, and this is where you and I met so often, 260 performances at the Met.
268.
Is it 268? I thought it was 260. Okay.
No, sir, I did my research. According to the Met Archives, it's 268.
You're more accurate than I am. Absolutely.
And so, yes, this is where we all met up and where I got to know your father, who I adored, who was always very kind to me. And he liked that our fathers had the same birthday. He liked that my Uncle Lou was on 38th Street. A lot of the stories that you
And
told,
his younger brother is Lou.
I
So my
purposely
uncle is
held
Lou.
back because your father and I would discuss these things that you all, it's very interesting that there's this synchronicity here. But when he made his debut at the Met in Werther, I was living in Milan, so I did not hear any of that. I was working at La Scala, so no complaints. But when I came back, I was not yet in my job at the Met as performance manager, but I was working at the Met. And he conducted Poulenc's Dialogues of the Carmelites. And I was on a podcast in France 2 days ago, talking in English and French about Regine Crespin. And Regine Crespin played the old prioress, Madame de Coissy, in that production in English because Poulenc had wanted that things be done in the original language. It had Maria Ewing, Mignon Dunn, Leona Mitchell, Betsy Norden, a great cast, Robert Notch. And Crespin was dazzling. And she and your father created such remarkable artistry in those scenes I had the privilege of being at rehearsals, so that I sat at all the rehearsals and watched him work. And it was interesting to see him work with a younger artist like Maria Ewing and Betsy Norden and Leona Mitchell, with whom he worked a lot. But then not have to coach Regine Crespin, but at the same time, she understood that he was the maestro. And that I said this on the podcast the other day, that she once said to me that to be a master in this art form, apart from the musicianship, you not only have to know the language, she said, mais il faut vivre la langue. You have to live the language.
Right.
And when she said that to me, and I discussed it with your dad, he said, absolutely. He said, I've done opera in translation all the time, but you have to live the translation, but primarily you have to live the language of the original source material. And that was a very big lesson for me, because after that, between Crespin and Maestro Rudel, I didn't call him Julius yet. He was Maestro Rudel to me then. And that became my new approach to opera, in terms of someone who did staging of opera and teaching of opera and coaching of opera, that yes, the musicianship is fundamental and the most important thing, but to create a great performance, il faut vivre la langue. And so those performances in 1980 were absolute turning points for me because of him and because of Crespin. And then, I could imagine that, great as he was at City Opera, that a lot of people would say, okay, he's not going to have anything to do after. He then had a brilliant career at the Met for 27 years. And
so, let me just jump in 2 things. So the night of his Met debut, I walked with him from our apartment down to Lincoln Center. My mother went with my sister, I think. And on the way down, he says, I just want to swing by the State Theater to check on the cast for the flute. They were doing Magic Flute that night. And I was like, are you kidding me? You're about to make your Met debut? But I wasn't going to argue with him. And he went in and checked, said hello to everybody, and he's in his tails. I'm holding the garment bag with the conducting jacket. So he says hello to everybody, and I'm looking at my watch, and it's 20 to 8. I go, Dad, curtains in 20 minutes. Maybe we should go over. And finally, at about quarter of, I convince him it's time to walk over to the Met stage door. And we're walking across the plaza. And he stops and he looks at me. And Fred, I'll never forget it because for a split second, I didn't know what to do. And he looked at me and said, let me ask you a question. What if I walk in the pit and they boo? And I said, why in God's name would they boo you? And he said, because maybe they think of me as being a traitor to the city opera. I said, Dad, there are 50 great singers who have all gone from one house to the other. None of them got booed. You're not going to get booed. And he said, okay. And we got to the house. Of course, we got to the house at 12 minutes of. And you can imagine everyone backstage was just a little bit nervous. So we go down to his dressing room, and I go up into the house. And I was actually sitting in the row behind Carl Brown, who was there to watch his friend make his debut. And Fred, when he walked into the pit for that Werther in 78, the house exploded. And it was as if the gods, opera gods had said, boy, are you stupid to even have thought that you'd get booed. But now let me go to the dialogues, because you'll notice the first two things you mentioned are both French operas. And he did a lot of French opera, as you know. I am sitting at the moment, and I can prove it, at his piano, which I inherited. And when he was learning dialogues for that production, I walked into the apartment one day, and he was sitting at the piano, and he as excited as a teenager, said to me, come over here, I want to show you something. He said, he describes the final scene to me, the march to the scaffold. And he, on the piano, starts the boom, 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 boom. And he says, now right here, the trumpets come in. And he played, and he acts it out on the piano for me. Well, then I went to the dress rehearsal, and I listened to the Met Orchestra do what he wanted them to do. And you remember it. It made your hair stand on end.
Oh, yeah.
It was terrifying the way he did it. And I remember thinking, he was plotting that effect from the moment he showed me what he wanted to do. Because the man was a man of the theater. It had to work theatrically. And I mean, it's a fabulous, the Dexter production is incredible. But he did other productions of it. And he drove that last scene the same way. So, yes, that was pretty special.
And he did, I had the pleasure in preparing for this of going back and looking up all the things he did. What struck me too is that many of the operas that he conducted, if they were not in French, were set in France, like Bohème, like André Chenier, like Manon Lescaut, or had French roots like Les Noces di Figaro. He clearly had an affinity for France that I never really got to ask him about. What can you tell me about that?
Well, it's interesting. You're absolutely right. Although the number one opera he did most frequently at the Met,
Butterfly.
40-something performances of Butterfly. And apparently that's because, what he told me, that Joe Volpe just loved the way he did Butterfly. So whenever a Butterfly came up, they said, well, get Rudel. And his Butterfly was pretty damn good. He conducted Butterfly at the Met on his 75th birthday, which was 25 years ago tomorrow, with Diana Soviero, another city opera transplant.
And a fabulous Butterfly, by the way.
Fabulous. And that was some performance.
Yeah.
So the French thing is interesting. I don't remember who the cellist was, but there was a letter to the editor of the Times, or in one of those little columns they did maybe 10 years ago. He was still alive because he found it very amusing that somebody in the Met Orchestra had once asked this French cellist, who the greatest French opera conductor was that he'd ever played under. He'd played under all the great French conductors. And he said Julius Rudel. And the reason he said he was the greatest French opera conductor is because he brought the same Viennese lilt to it that he brings to Viennese music. He also firmly believed, Fred, that French opera is too often left to wallow, that you have to move it, that you have to have the drama. And we talked earlier a little bit about Pelleas and Melisandre, which was one of his absolute favorites. If you listen to there's a broadcast that he did in San Francisco, and there's also their pirate recordings of the City Opera. If you listen to his interpretation and compare it to any recording, it's much more theatrical. It's not this sort of, taffy French thing. It moves. And I think that's the combination of the drama and that Viennese, the Luftpause effect, that makes his French music so special. What's ironic is in the symphonic realm, where he had a pretty decent career as a symphonic conductor, he rarely did French music. And I just don't know why.
So now that you mentioned that, Pelleas, I admire its genius. It's not my favorite opera. We all connect to different things, and I respect it more than love it. And the one time I heard it recently, relatively recently, was conducted by Simon Rattle, where I really did love it and found it highly theatrical. So I just am throwing this at you. It may have nothing with it, but did your father ever work with, correspond with Simon Rattle? Because,
No.
Rattle's Pelleas and Melisandre was so different from just about every other. I want to talk about another fun experience I had with your dad. He conducted Die Fledermaus at the Met often, and his being a Viennese man, understood the particular lilt and humor and irony and sexiness. And there is a lot of sex in Fledermaus if you allow it to go in, several times. And it had casts that were often foreigners who spoke excellent English, but didn't necessarily put over the lines all that well. And frankly, the lines were written so the joke would hang there waiting for the audience to laugh, and the audience didn't laugh. And it was the fault really of the translation, which at that time when we worked on it was Otto Schenk, who took it from his Viennese original, and where it was very funny in Viennese German, it was not in any way funny in American New York English. What are the ladies like down below was a line where there were two women downstairs. Maybe that works in Austrian German. It did not work in American English. But people who know that opera know that there's the role of Frosch, the drunken jailer. And I worked on several versions of that production, but that year we had Sid Caesar, the legendary American comic actor, who was a very serious man about his comedy. He was not Mel Brooks. He was not funny off the stage. He was serious off the stage. And he needed a lot of consoling, including a lot of consoling from me, that he would be fine. And he was concerned about all of these important opera singers, and especially Tatiana Troyanos, who he had admired. And but also even Neil Rosenshine, not even, but what I mean is a nice American Jewish guy. You would think that they would have a little more getting on, but Sid Caesar was intimidated by these opera singers. And did your father talk about working with him and trying to get him to relax?
So he did. And it's very funny because I just listened to a rebroadcast of that the other day. And it is one incredible performance from a musical standpoint. I mean, it is. And the overture, I don't think the overture's ever been played that fast before or since. But so my father had nothing but respect and admiration for Sid Caesar. One of the reasons was, I don't know if you know this, but the Show of Shows original writing team was housed in the office building above the city center.
I do know that, yeah.
And so my father used to get in the elevator and see them all.
So we're
But he
talking Neil
actually,
Simon, Woody Allen, Mel
oh,
Brooks,
it's
Carl
Mel Brooks,
Reiner. Yeah.
incredible, you know.
Yep.
But and he met Sid Caesar evidently back in the 50s in that
Mm.
elevator. So when I was growing up at City Opera, the frush was usually a guy named Coley Worth, who was a vaudeville guy who was hysterical. But I think Dad worked with Sid Caesar alone a little bit
Yes.
because he was trying to get him to loosen up and have more fun with it. And yeah, some of the lines are ridiculous, as you point out, but he's pretty funny. And he made it. My father encouraged him to make some of the lines more topical. So he said, remember that was January of '89, the broadcast anyway.
Yeah. The issue was December '88. We worked on it. Yep.
Right. And that was right after the presidential election that Reagan was done and George Bush was coming in. So there's a line Caesar says, which I'm sure my father gave him, which was, cell number 4 has all the political prisoners in it, and boy, is it crowded. But we better get rid of those people because there's a whole new administration coming in and we're going to need the space. And I'm sure it's my father's political sensibilities was in there somewhere. But yeah, I mean, he loved comedy. He loved theater. He did musical theater for summer after summer after summer in the 50s. So a guy like Sid Caesar was to him joy to work with.
I want to point out about him too, that at the Met, and this was where we overlapped a lot, that he often worked with singers who are now the world's biggest stars early on and helped form them, especially Renee Fleming, but also Bryn Tervel. And people don't remember this, but Maria Gulagina came in and at the start of her career was one of the most fiery, sensational Toscas that anyone had ever seen, and was ranked among the greatest of her generation in that role. And in fact, it was her last performance at the Met was Tosca. And I didn't recall your dad conducted that. It had Domingo and Milnes, and it was a very big deal at the time in about 93. And so I know that he had this remarkable gift for forming and launching. Leona Mitchell was another young artist he worked with a great deal. Catherine Malfitano, another one at the start of her career and for quite a long time. Did he ever talk to you about what it took to work with young artists and help form them, to give them their wings, but also protect them?
He loved young artists. He loved the freshness, the approach. We sometimes talked about what was happening in the world of music, and right around his 90th birthday, when there were a lot of honors. I mean, the Austrian government honored him with the Ehrenkreuz and all this. And Mannes College of Music, Joe Colinari, who I know you know, Joe, and Joe Colinari was doing a così that they were dedicating to my father. And he went to one of the rehearsals at Joe's invitation, and I went with him. And there was a wonderful young cast of singers. And Joe said, "Maestro, do you have anything to tell them?" Now, that could be intimidating. If you're a 20-something-year-old singer and there's 90-year-old Julius Rudel. And he said to them, "You're not having enough fun with it." And he just tried to get them to sing it more fun. And he insisted, you talked before about Crespin language. He insisted that they know what they were saying, that they understood the meaning of the words and the connectivity of the words. But nothing thrilled him more than a young singer. I mean, think about it. In 1973, how old you have her birth date there? Kiri was how old?
Kiri was born March 6, 1944. So 1973.
And in 1976, she would have been 33 years old.
Yeah.
And she's
and I do know she made her Met debut February 9th, I think, 1974 as Desdemona with the Vickers.
Right. So, but there she is doing her first Fior di Legge in Paris. And he got to work with her on that.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's where that kind of relationship begins. He loved young singers, and he loved shaping them. And that was one of the great things about City Opera. Look, I remember Sam Raimi on a Sunday afternoon. I went with my mother. It was a Sunday matinee in 1972, I think, and it was Carmen. And the Zuniga is this guy named Sam Raimi. And we went out to dinner afterwards. My father said, I think he's going to be good. I'm going to start moving him. And you could see him plotting already for Sam. Next, he's going to do this. And then he's going to, we're going to, and yeah,
I do hope one day, who I know Sam for a long time, to have him on this program. He, in effect, often took up the roles that were created by Norman Treigle at City Opera early on. And both wonderful, very physical singers and actors. And Raimi, too, went on to great success that he deserved. I want to talk about one last production, and then I got to go, unfortunately. I noticed, by the way, that as I've gone through the year, that we know the cycles, that I face southwest, and that's where the sun is. So next week, friends, I'm going to have my curtains down for this broadcast. But Handel's Samson, his having conducted the famous Giulio Cesare at City Opera, the Met had not really done much Handel. The very first Handel they did was Rinaldo with Marilyn Horne. I worked on it December 20th, or so of 1984, maybe a little earlier than December, maybe November. But then the next thing to come in was the oratorio, 3.5 hours of oratorio staged by Elijah Moshinsky, a dear friend who died recently of COVID, unfortunately. And he was to be on the show this month, but sadly not. And Elijah created a beautiful but very austere staging. Staging an oratorio in English, 3.5 hours, is not easy. And it's the story of Samson and Delilah. And John Vickers was Samson, and extraordinary as he was in everything.
Titanic.
Leona Mitchell was Delilah, I believe, a beautiful Delilah. And then there's the role of the Israelite woman. And at the premiere, it was Carol Vaness, who came up through City Opera. But then Kiri Takanawa, who 3 years before had sung Let the Bright Seraphim at the royal wedding of Charles and Diana, was, they basically brought her in for the broadcast, and she did 2 or 3 performances of it. So I was not too involved in that production, and I never really got to ask Julius or Elijah or Kiri even. She didn't even work the production about it, or Vaness, and Vickers you didn't talk to unless you were spoken to. So
true.
So do you have any recollections of that time and his working on that?
You unfortunately have to go back to 1976 and understand that Rolf Lieberman, or 78, maybe it was 78, Lieberman's last big production in Paris was Coronation of Poppaea. My father conducted it, and the cast was John Vickers, Gwyneth Jones, Krista Ludwig, Nikolai Giaurov, Richard Stilwell, Valerie Masterson, and Michel Seneschal.
God.
Perhaps the greatest cast ever assembled, certainly the greatest cast ever assembled for Monteverdi.
Yeah.
And Vickers, of course, approached Baroque music very differently than my father did, having done the Caesar. And they had many battles over that production and my father almost resigned from it, but Lieberman talked him out of resigning. And it's pirated, you can hear it everywhere. It was done for TV also, and that's available. So it was very surprising a few years later, when the 300th anniversary of Handel's birth is coming along, that 3 opera houses, Covent Garden, the Met, and Chicago, decided to co-produce Handel's Samson for John Vickers, one of the great Titanic Samsons of all time. And who does John ask to have conduct? Julius Rudel. So in October of 1982, my father was doing Così in Chicago, and I went to hear it because I was actually there on business, so I heard it. And then we were staying with a friend of his who had a very large house in Chicago. And Vickers was staying there too, rehearsing whatever he was doing in November, let's say. Now we come home from the performance of Così, and Vickers is in the kitchen. So he and my father start talking. And Vickers looks at my father and says, "Now, Julius, when we do the Samson, none of your goddamn embellishments. We're going to do it my way." My father looks and says, "John, are we going to start fighting about this now? It's not for 3 more years." He says, "I want it." And they argued well into the night. So he goes to London to do the production. And in London, Carol Van Ness was the Delilah. Now, if you recall the production, they're up on the cart, basically, and he's chained. And while Carol, during the dress rehearsal, was singing her aria, he started rattling his chains.
Like Fidelio.
Right, which didn't make Carol very happy. Well, the tension in those rehearsals was mind-blowing. And I remember, my father did not show nerves. But before that opening night at Covent Garden, he was visibly nervous. And what's funny, of course, is Baroque opera performance has come so far since that 1966 Caesar. It's changed so much. And some critics thought it was spectacular on its terms, and others thought it was musically ridiculous because you wouldn't have a Vickers singing that role, in the modern way of doing Baroque opera. But there was one review that really pissed my father off. And I don't remember who it was, but it was a well-known critic who wrote in his review that why would you entrust this Handel masterpiece to the man who massacred Julius Caesar? And this was the same critic who in 1966 had written in his review of the Julius Caesar, "This is one of the greatest masterpieces. Julius Rudel deserves all the credit." So it's funny how in 20 years, he went from hero to goat. Yeah. But I went to all 3 of those productions, London, New York, and Chicago. Each one was different in how he conducted it or how he did it. And he and Vickers, look, working with John Vickers was never easy, but they understood each other and they stood up to each other. Here's one for you, Fred, that I bet you didn't know. The day of my grandmother's funeral, my father's mother's funeral in 1962, he got on a train and went down to Philadelphia because he had to conduct that night. You know what he conducted that night? The Valkyrie with John Vickers.
Wow.
Yeah. Isn't that wild?
So,
and I asked him, how could you do that? How could you bury your mother and get on a train and go conduct? And he said, because when I walk into the pit, everything else disappears.
I've known many musicians who have been in that situation. Kiri Takanoa, she was in New York when her father died, and she was singing Strauss's 4 last songs at the Philharmonic. And she said, "I'm staying. The audience wants me. I will get home to New Zealand when I can." And it helped her, I think, particularly that music of all things, given the subject
those
matter.
4 songs. Yeah.
You mentioned before the 104 bus. We New Yorkers refer to our buses for geography. The last time I saw your dad was on the number 10 bus going uptown. And I sat down with him, and by then I was calling him Julius. And he got off, I don't know, 70th Street, 68th Street, something like that. And I am further uptown. And we chatted, and then he got up and he shook my hand and he said, "We had a lot of fun, didn't we?" And I said, "Yes, Julius, we certainly did." And he said it with the kind of summation of finality that he didn't seem ill and he was moving on his own. So it wasn't that. But I think maybe he was already in that reflective mode that you were talking about.
Yeah.
And
he came to that late in life.
Yeah. And so I'm going to borrow his line as I close and say, Tony, we had a lot of fun, didn't we?
Fred, I could do this with you whenever you want. This is so much fun.
Thank you.
But I want to see you in person soon. So hopefully we'll get there.
That would be a pleasure. You're in Boston, where apparently the sun is not shining the way it is in New
York.
I
have all the curtains closed around.
Okay.
So.
Well, Tony, thank you very much. And
thank you.
Julius Rudel,
happy birthday to your father.
Birthday, and to yours, and to Kiri Takanoa.
And Lauren Mazel.
And Michelangelo Buonarroti, 1475.
A good day
Tony,
for people.
take care. Thank you. And thank you to all the listeners. And I will see you next week.